I wanted to share with you a article by Alan McLeod from InPress News. It's about Saagar Enjeti, who you may know from The Rising with Crystal Ball, and also a co-host of Breaking Points, which is their new show, which started 2 or 3 weeks ago. Literally within that time, they've got about 400 and something thousand people following. So that's pretty good going for a newly, even though they've had a run-up with The Rising, funded by the Hudson Institute, and I'm going to, that'll be explored in this particular article. And I wanted to share the whole article, and it's I've added some images to it to kind of spice it up a little bit. But it explores the Hudson Institute and also Saagar Enjeti's background, and also talks about how he elaborates on the kind of things he said that are very imperialist, particularly his pushing back on China, his basically putting out CIA talking points about China. And if you follow this channel, you know that there's been a massive effort, a bipartisan effort, to basically create a war with China, to cause a war with China, because China is becoming a greater economic power than the US, and the imperialist endeavors of the US, which are legendary and ongoing, are all about capitalism, basically. As Douglas Valentine from his book said, one of the people from the CIA said the CIA is the invisible army of capitalism. So anyway, the Hudson Institute is a very big proponent of basically pushing a lot of anti-China propaganda, and the Hudson Institute was, as I mentioned, funding The Hill, which funds The Rising, which is Crystal Ball and Saagar Enjeti's former podcast they had, and they're trying to develop this left and right populist movement, which I've talked about this before, where they sort of, Enjeti is trying to conflate the two as if they both have the same end goals, which they do not. And the left certainly should not have imperialist objectives either. So I see this kind of thing, and this is not just isolated to Enjeti, but there is this push to normalize imperialism within the left. And I'm not talking even about the pretend left, the blue checks and the corporate Democrats and all of that. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the so-called progressive part of the Democratic Party, the Squad and all of that. I'm talking about the real left, or people that think that they're the real left, and he's trying, I feel, this is speculation, but from what I've gathered from watching him on occasion, he's trying to normalize imperialist aims and also even American exceptionalism amongst the left. And he throws in leftist talking points and then a right-wing talking point, and he's mixing it up and normalizing this, which is a real problem. And it is a, you could even call it a psyops, really. It's really trying to basically, it's infiltrated the left already, and it's trying to basically destroy the left from within. You may think that sounds very alarmist and a bit conspiratorial even, but when you see the kind of background Saagar Enjeti has, and the fact that I'm not sure what's going on with Crystal Ball, but she just sits there and lets him spout off anti-China propaganda, CIA talking points continually, I'm not sure what's going on with her, but definitely with him, he is trying to assist in this basically concerted and intentional effort by a number of right-wingers to infiltrate the left by throwing in leftist talking points and mixing them up and then normalizing different things, and also definitely defending capitalism, which, I'm sorry, it has to go. It is basically, fascism is capitalism in decay, as I mentioned before. And, this is something that the US in particular, the US empire, is bringing in more and more fascistic laws into the US, including being anti-capitalist illegal and calling people that are doing that domestic violent extremists. And so, I think that it's more, this sort of thing, what Enjeti is engaged in, and others that are basically being invited in by the left. This is something that is worse than any Fox News host. It's worse than any kind of attempts by Trumpers or anybody else. It's worse than the Democratic Party and the Squad basically trying to normalize soft imperialism and putting out CIA talking points every so often, but then pushing leftist stuff too. It's worse than that, because this is not politicians doing that. This is podcast hosts and attractive ones at that, trying to normalize imperialism and also keep a hold of, defending capitalism at any cost. There's never any question whether capitalism should go or not, which is insane because you cannot put a happy face on capitalism. Anyway, so I'm going to share this with you because I really think that Alan McLeod did a great job, and he's a prolific writer at Mint Press News, so please subscribe to Mint Press News. I think that he's done a great job in outlining this. And of course, Robbie Martin from Media Roots Radio, that is an excellent podcast to subscribe to on SoundCloud and other platforms. Robbie Martin has been very, very clear about Saagar Enjeti for a long time, and also about Tucker Carlson. He gets into the weeds on different things, and so please subscribe to that. And Abby Martin, his sister, is also doing Media Roots Radio, so if you haven't subscribed to that, please do, because it's always interesting. So basically they try to fit 4 podcasts into a month, and they're always really spot on. So anyway, please check this out, and thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Fancy Circles from Bega. Till next time, bye for now. Stay tuned. Saagar Enjeti, the pseudo-populist mainlining neocon ideas into progressive politics. While he is undeniably a charismatic and confident host, Saagar Enjeti's shtick is remarkably similar to that of his former employer, Tucker Carlson, who also rails against elites while being one of them, by Alan McLeod from Mint Press News. 2nd of July 2021. Saagar Enjeti and Crystal Ball and the new king and queen of alternative media. After having just quit The Hill to go fully independent, their new show, Breaking Points, immediately debuted at #1 in the global politics podcast charts, comfortably overtaking well-established brands like Pod Save America, The Ben Shapiro Show. They even received the ultimate plug from an appearance on and an endorsement from Joe Rogan, a veritable blessing from the Pope of pop culture. And actually, the first day that they did their first show, I think they had 220,000 subscribers on the first day, which is really amazing. And really, in some ways, I don't know, sometimes that makes me wonder, because YouTube isn't usually that forgiving, unless there's just something strange about that, to have 220,000 subscribers on your first day. Anyway, Breaking Points is effectively a copy of Rising, Enjeti and Ball's show on the Hill. Rising had the look and tone of a capable news show, with 2 well-presented and attractive hosts chatting to guests in a brightly lit studio. But it had far more substance, featuring stories and points of view that are completely ignored in the rest of corporate media. The 2 invited on a range of informative guests, the caliber of whom is simply not found on cable news. Thus it had a jarringly subversive quality that appealed to viewers, as if the 2 were smuggling forbidden but increasingly popular ideas, all while maintaining a polished corporate feel. Ball is a progressive, while Enjeti is a conservative. Nevertheless, both present themselves as populists who have a lot in common, sometimes something that was the central message of their best-selling book, The Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and Left Are Rising. While Ball's political outlook could be described as relatively standard, Bernie Sanders-style populism, Enjeti is more of an enigma. While he identifies as a conservative Republican, he also labels himself a pro-worker, pro-union populist. Key to his appeal is convincing progressive audiences that, although a conservative, he is still a political outsider with views not too dissimilar from their own. Yet a look into Enjeti's background and professional career suggests otherwise, that he is very much an insider and is pulling a similar trick to so many Republicans of late, who are rebranding as anti-elite, anti-deep state warriors, all the while mainstreaming some highly problematic viewpoints to his audience. Before becoming a populist media personality, Enjeti appeared to be training for the role of deep state official, pursuing an undergraduate degree at George Washington University and a master's degree in security studies at Georgetown University, both D.C. area colleges well known for their connections to the national security state. Enjeti also decided to study counterterrorism studies at Israeli University, IDC, Herzliya. Situated on a former military base, the university's board boasts a former head of Mossad and ex-Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Meanwhile, its international advisory board is replete with U.S. national security leaders such as Robert Hutchings, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, Stephen Peter Rosen, one-time director of political military affairs at the White House National Security Council, and ex-CIA Chief James Woolsey. The master's program in counterterrorism studies features modules in profiling terrorist strategy and deterrence, Arab language, Iranian studies, and a course called Hezbollah, a hybrid terrorist organization. This is an institution that trains Israeli and American intelligence officials, not radical populist outsiders. The Counterterrorism Studies Department is headed by Dr. Boaz Ganor, an Israeli government advisor. During the latest Israeli assault on Gaza, IDC Herzliya's president sent out a message to students condemning the Gazans' supposed wanton aggressiveness. Quote, "These rockets were fired at a civilian population with the intent to kill," end quote, he seethed. Luckily, he said, with the help of Dr. Ganor and coordination with the Israeli-American Council and the use of ACT-IL, ACT.IL, an Israeli government-funded app, which, as Mint Press reported in May, helps Zionists artificially infiltrate online conversations and flood them with pro-Israel messages, public opinion was holding firm. While still in university, Enjeti landed a job at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, writing policy briefs about the conflict in Afghanistan and analysing the moves and strength of the Taliban. The ISW is a notoriously hawkish think tank funded by weapons contractors like Raytheon, General Dynamics, and DynCorp. Its board filled with retired generals and infamous neoconservative warmongers like Bill Kristol. Robbie Martin, a filmmaker whose movie series A Very Heavy Agenda deals with the rise of neoconservatism, told Mint Press about his misgivings. Quote, "The Institute for the Study of War is one of the most enmeshed DC think tanks in terms of active military policy with the US government. It is probably the most influential military-centric think tank in Washington. It is always encouraging war, which should be obvious by its name," end quote. ISW officials were at the wheel in the drive towards war in Iraq and have since called for more aggressive actions in Syria and other nations. The organization also served as embedded advisors for General David Petraeus while he was commander in Afghanistan. The ISW was created by the Kagan family, a group of the most influential hawks in Washington. As Martin explained, Donald Kagan is a neocon patriarch helping to craft the infamous Project for a New American Century document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which called for a, quote, new Pearl Harbor, end quote, and set out the neocon imperial agenda for the Bush administration. His son Fred was the brains behind the 2007 Iraq surge, in quotes, the dramatic increase in US troop numbers in the country. Fred's wife Kim, a military officer and historian, founded the ISW. Meanwhile, Donald's other son, Robert, is a media pundit, most noted for being the driving force, falsely linking Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 attacks, an assertion that helped grease the skids for the Iraq invasion. Robert's wife, Victoria Nuland, is arguably the most powerful neocon of the clan, having held a host of high government positions, including ambassador to NATO, assistant secretary of state for European and Eurasian affairs, and undersecretary of state for political affairs. Nuland has been involved in virtually every US intervention in the last 30 years and was previously crowned, quote, Queen of the Chicken Hawks, end quote, by writer Rick Sterling. From the ISW, Enjeti later moved to the Hudson Institute, an equally neoconservative and pro-Iraq war think tank where he worked as a media fellow until last year. Like the ISW, Hudson takes money from a cavalcade of weapons manufacturers, including Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. The Hudson Institute is a standard-bearer for establishment republicanism, as can be seen by a mere glance at its senior figures. Hudson's president and CEO, John P. Waters, is a long-time Republican official serving among other roles as George W. Bush's drugs czar. Its senior vice president is Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff. As soon as he left office earlier this year, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also walked into a senior position at the organization. Hudson was founded in 1961 by war planner Herman Kahn, a man so bloodthirsty and dotty that he served as a principal inspiration for the title character in the movie Dr. Strangelove. Indeed, Dr. Strangelove himself was so similar to Kahn that the latter reportedly demanded a cut of the movie's earnings. Previous recipients of the organization's annual awards include warmongers like Ronald Reagan, Henry Kissinger, and Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as figures such as Rupert Murdoch and Mike Pence. Until recently, Enjeti's second podcast, The Realignment, was an official Hudson publication, hosted with fellow Hudson employee Marshall Kozlov. The two lobbed softball questions to reactionary guests like Mike Pompeo, Niall Ferguson, and Douglas Murray. The concept of the show is that there is a profound political realignment happening in America right now, as old political demarcations are broken down and new ones formed. In this sense, it is similar notion to the Rising and Breaking Points, except that it is being pushed by one of the most establishment conservative organizations in America, raising questions about how genuine this realignment is. In Martin's view, quote, before Saagar was the co-host of Rising with Crystal, Rising was not a populist-themed political show at all. It was not really that progressive, and when Saagar got there, it almost seemed like it became a TV show version of this podcast, end quote. Enjeti presents himself as an anti-war populist. Quote, the entire reason I am interested in politics is because of 9/11 and opposition to the war in Iraq. It is my North Star and always will be, end quote, he said in a recent episode of Rising. But this is difficult to square with the fact that he chose to study counterterrorism in Israel and to work for two of the most hawkish neoconservative think tanks in America, the same think tanks whose principles laid the groundwork for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that Enjeti claims so vociferously to oppose. That an anti-war outsider could choose to work for the likes of the Kagan family does not compute. On foreign policy, Enjeti seems to have been at least partially influenced by the Hudson Institute's stances. If there is one issue the think tank concentrates on most, it is China. In recent years, they have become almost obsessed with opposing it.
So last question for you here, sir. One of the things we see in the rise of the Democratic candidates is almost an embrace or a want of a multipolar U.S. system, almost of a shirking of the superpower, because they take a frame that this superpower status of the United States is implicitly harmful to the other world. I mean, I think I have, and the posture of this podcast really is that a world in which America retreats is in a world in which China rises and makes us all less free. But maybe make that case for some of our listeners.
So look, the simplest rule.
And to add one thing to that too, people also say that superpower status leads to endless wars. Right. That sort of trope.
The simplest and oldest rule of international politics is you run the show or the show runs you. And for almost a century, certainly for the last 75 years, the United States has been able to run the show. I understand there are a lot of anti-American voices on the left who blame America first for every problem around the world and think that the world would be a better place if America were less involved in it, that we should be more like the world rather than the world being more like America. I fundamentally reject that idea, and the vast majority of Americans do as well. They want the power, the economic power, the military power, to be able to run the show. That doesn't mean that we're going to be the world's policeman. It doesn't mean that we're going to be able to bring democracy to lands that has never prospered before. But it does mean that we'll have the power that's necessary to defend the interests of the American people all around the world, from an economic standpoint and from a security standpoint. And hopefully, this is part of the reason why you have a dominant military, dominant economy, is that you don't have to use that power to begin with. It is a latent power that all of our adversaries recognize around the world, and they understand there's no point in even challenging the American military. There's no point in trying to displace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. There's no point in trying to beat us in trade deals, because we have so much latent power to bring to bear that we can crush any adversary that attempts to do so, whether it's on the field of battle or whether it's in the marketplace.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us, sir. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator.
The word China and its derivatives appear 137 times in the organization's most recent annual report, featuring on every page. In a recent interview with Fox News, Hudson's senior fellow and China expert David Asher demanded that the U.S. bring the country, quote, to heel, end quote, as if it were a dog.
So I can't fix the partisanship in this town, but we can fix what the communist Chinese did to try to undermine our country and the world system with COVID. Even if they didn't do it deliberately, they knew it would spread, they let it spread, and it cost us millions of lives. And that we have to bring these people to heel over in communist China.
If not
treating the lab leak hypothesis as an, quote, undisputed fact, end quote, Asher railed. Quote, we've got to hold the Chinese accountable, end quote. We have to, quote, fix what the communist Chinese did to try to undermine our country and the world system with COVID, end quote, he explained. The friendly Fox News anchor asked if sanctioning the country and relocating the 2022 Winter Olympic Games would be enough punishment. Probably not, Asher replied, leaving the possibility open for war. Left unstated in all this is that Hudson has flourished and rapidly expanded thanks, in no part, to huge donations from the independence-minded government of Taiwan. Between 2015 and 2019, the organization's revenue more than quadrupled to $57.1 million. Hudson does not disclose how much Taiwan is giving them, except to say that the island has been on its list of highest-tier donors every year since they began divulging their sponsors in 2015. Not coincidentally, Hudson is among the most vociferous supporters of greater Taiwanese independence. Hudson appears, however, to accept even more money from bitter China enemy Japan. In 2020, the organization, then CEO Kenneth Weinstein, was chosen as a U.S. ambassador to Japan, although the appointment later fell through. Hudson also takes money from other China-hostile countries like South Korea. 22 years ago, a group of neoconservative think tanks used their power to push for disastrous wars in the Middle East. Now a new set of think tanks staffed with many of the same experts and funded by Taiwanese money is working hard to convince Americans that there is a new existential threat, China. Many critics have argued that true economic populism cannot be conservative and that the right-wing populist variants attempt to unite a majority around issues of religion, as in Modi's India, or race, as in Nazi Germany, deflecting popular frustration towards and using minorities as scapegoats for the country's problems. Enjeti has tried to square the circle of raging against the elites while leaving the system in place by blaming so many of America's failings on China, combining populist rhetoric with Hudson-style foreign policy. In a populist guide to 2020, he claims that the malaise the country is in can be explained as in no small part due to, quote, China's economic warfare, end quote. The bad guys in Enjeti's story of American corporations relocating eastward to use hyper-exploited Asian workers are not the corporations themselves, nor the US government, but the Chinese Communist Party, deviously convincing businesses to do so, a classic bait-and-switch maneuver. Quote, corporations and the billionaire class sold us all out a very long time ago, he states, sounding like Bernie Sanders, before claiming that doing business with China is akin to, quote, American monopolies' tacit cooperation with the Nazi regime before the outbreak of World War II, end quote, he concludes. Quote, the people who control our banks, who control what we see, what we laugh at, who we watch play sports, are all now beholden to some very bad people in Beijing. And Beijing isn't shy about using its economic entanglements with us to try and force American citizens to behave however they like, end quote. I love the way people use the word bad people. I mean, how old are they? In this, he is borrowing a tactic often used by his former boss at the Daily Caller, Tucker Carlson. Quote, working class people of all colours have a lot more in common, infinitely more in common with each other than they do with some overpaid MSNBC anchor. And if you were allowed to think about that for long enough, you might start to get unauthorized ideas about economics, and that would be disruptive to a very lucrative status quo, end quote. No, that was not Bernie Sanders or even Noam Chomsky. It was indeed Tucker Carlson, who often fills his audience with populist-sounding rhetoric, only to redirect legitimate anger away from capitalism and towards woke college students, gypsies, or Latino immigrants. For decades, however, Carlson was a preppy bow-tie-wearing, quote, out-of-the-closet elitist, end quote, who described ordinary Americans as, quote, peasants, end quote. The stepson of the heir of the Swanson food empire and the son of Dick Carlson, the head of Voice of America and a U.S. ambassador, Tucker revealed in how, quote, extraordinarily loaded, end quote, his family was, condemning Bill O'Reilly's faux populism as phony, only to switch to exactly the same shtick when he replaced O'Reilly on Fox News in 2017. While Rising has a distinctly progressive audience, Enjeti has been pushing the Hudson's neoconservative talking points on foreign policy. Enjeti is an unabashed imperialist who wants the United States to control the planet, as he stated himself on the realignment. Quote, I am not for a multipolar world. I want to be the only blue water navy. I don't want the Chinese ruling the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, end quote. In early 2020, Enjeti delighted in using the racist term, the China virus, for COVID-19, telling Rising viewers that it is, quote, the height of cynical political correctness, end quote, to get outraged at it. In a long soliloquy about wrestlers, John Cena correcting his inaccurate statement that Taiwan is an independent country, Enjeti again tried to launder aggression against China as a progressive position. Quote, the elites of this country do not work for us, do not really like us, and are completely for sale, end quote, he roared. For sale to whom? Not to the likes of Jeff Bezos, the government, or giant corporate interests, but to the, quote, authoritarian and cultish, end quote, Chinese Communist Party. Quote, the Chinese have achieved total victory, end quote, he exclaimed. quote, they are able to control the very speech that comes out of the most powerful people in America's mouths, end quote. That Senna, an American, would apologize for such a huge faux pas akin to traveling to Kiev to announce, quote, Ukraine is forever Russia, end quote, is seen only as more proof that the US is secretly under Chinese control. Undisclosed in all of this is a gigantic conflict of interest inherent in the fact that Enjeti's salary at the Hudson Institute came courtesy of piles of cash donated by the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry. As soon as Joe Biden won the election, Enjeti was warning that he was secretly a Chinese asset and using faux populist language to do so. Quote, big business is wholly in bed with the Chinese Communist Party, end quote, he explained, warning that, quote, China will use Wall Street to control Joe Biden, end quote, as if the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, is a mere puppet of a foreign country halfway around the globe. He also praised Donald Trump for, quote, changing the conversation around China, end quote. Early, Enjeti had tarred Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg with the same brush. In a segment entitled, quote, Is Mike Bloomberg a Chinese asset, end quote, he condemned Bloomberg News for supposedly, quote, kowtowing to the Chinese regime, end quote, and, quote, covering up the crimes of the Chinese elite, end quote. If this sort of rhetoric were used against a country like Israel, it would rightly be challenged and regarded as highly suspect. Indeed, when a guest attempted to smear Bloomberg's opponent, Tulsi Gabbard, as a tool of Russia, both Ball and Enjeti quickly jumped in to shut it down. Yet Ball, whose strong suit may not be foreign policy, generally stays silent or even agrees with Enjeti's anti-China tirades. Unsurprisingly, Enjeti has also been one of the loudest proponents of the lab leak theory of the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, recording long monologues about the media's failure to take it seriously for over a year while inviting neoconservative warmongers like Josh Rogan to discuss China's guilt, describing the lab leak as, quote, the most likely explanation for the origin of COVID-19, end quote. Enjeti told viewers that we should be, quote, 10 times more skeptical of the Chinese government, end quote. If only we had this knowledge earlier, he laments, American foreign policy would be far different. Quote, the Chinese are expanding all across Southeast Asia, end quote, he exclaims, implicitly suggesting that some sort of confrontation is an appropriate response, echoing the Hudson line. While he is undeniably a charismatic and confident host, Enjeti's shtick is remarkably similar to that of his employer, Tucker Carlson, who also rails against elites while being one of them. Other establishment hawks like General Michael Flynn and General Robert Spalding, another Hudson employee, have also attempted to sell themselves as anti-establishment, populist, and outsiders, but with far less success. Enjeti has been more successful partly because he is a more likable figure and partly because the others have decades-long histories in the heart of the swamp. Yet a deep dive into his background, from a counterterrorism student in Israel to a Kagan family think tank to the Hudson Institute, shows Enjeti is far more likely to be a run-of-the-mill conservative cosplaying as a populist than a genuine ally of anti-establishment movements. Unfortunately, people are so desperate for genuine populism that they are willing to swallow anything.